Hello, JBS viewers. I'm David Harris, and this is Fighting Anti-Semitism, the ISGAP Hour. That's ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, founded by Dr. Charles Small and chaired today by the legendary Natan Sharansky. I myself got involved with ISGAP about a year ago because in looking around, I thought, here's an organization that's doing something serious, tangible, and unique. It's addressing the deeply rooted issues on American campuses, and it's also looking at the money trail, which today has become a very popular topic of conversation, thanks in such large measure to the research of ISGAP. So, the founding director is with me again in the studio, Dr. Charles Small. Charles, welcome.
Hi, nice to be here with you.
Charles, I think more and more people are asking the same kinds of questions. Just the other day, the Director of National Intelligence for the United States of America spoke about Iran's long tentacles in America and seeking to manipulate public opinion and so forth. Lots of conversations about Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood. You have unique insight because you saw this issue early. What's going on?
So it's a good question. It's a complicated landscape. I would say, in a sense, what Professor Elie Wiesel always argued is that anti-Semitism is an early warning system for democracy, for society. Anti-Semitism, in a sense, always begins with Jewish people, but it never ends with Jewish people. And now we see the results of 40 years of funding by the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is an organization or a social movement that took European anti-Semitism, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the words and ideas that led to the Holocaust, and fused it with a perversion of Islam.
Let me interrupt you. You said 40 years. You didn't pick that number randomly.
No.
Why 40 years? What's the reference point?
So the reference point is that for 40 years, the Muslim Brotherhood, first with Saudi Arabia and other entities, and now especially with Qatar, have been targeting American higher education, targeting democracies. We know that their strategic goals of the Muslim Brotherhood is to destroy democracy. They want to destroy America, the big Satan, and of course destroy Israel, the little Satan. And they stated in their strategic objectives 40 years ago that they wanted to distance Israel from the United States, to weaken it, to isolate it and weaken it, to destroy it, and then to use anti-Semitism to fragment and weaken the United States of America. So this is the goal of radical Islam. And it's not shocking then if we have Qatar, a tiny country of less than 350,000 citizens, giving more money to American higher education than any country in the world, including our European allies, Canada, Russia, China. And they're giving more money to higher education. And Iran, even though it's a Shiite country, it still follows the intellectual leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is the same ideology, same goals. So these nefarious forces are trying to weaken the United States by fomenting anti-Semitism and fragmentation and social unrest. And they've been doing this, I think, sort of right under our noses in a very concrete, systematic, strategic manner, and they're having success. So I think it's wonderful that now the federal government is realizing that Iran is playing with the student movement and with the anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli politics on our streets and in our classrooms, and it should be a wake-up call to American society as a whole, and certainly to our community, the Jewish community.
Charles, but some viewers may say, wait a second, preposterous. We barely know what the Muslim Brotherhood is. Qatar is a tiny speck on the map. They want to destabilize, divide, and fragment the United States of America. This is just some crazy conspiracy theory, is it?
Look, it's a good question. I think, first of all, we in the West, and even in the Jewish community and in democracies around the world, we don't really understand the Muslim Brotherhood. We don't know who they are. We don't know their ideology. We don't know their politics. We don't know their strategic goals. But on the other hand, radical political Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood, like Qatar, like Iran, they speak our language. They study our society. They know the way we govern. They know our institutions and institutions of higher education and the media. and they know how it works. They've mastered, in a sense, our culture, and they're using soft power to manipulate this country and to further their goals. So this is not a conspiracy theory. It's what we argue at ISGAP is that we really need to educate our community on this war, and I'm choosing my words carefully. There's a war against the Jewish people, there's a war against democracy, there's a war against the United States of America, and we need to understand the minds of our enemies, the strategy, the strategic goals of our enemy, and what they're doing to foment anti-Semitism, to weaken America, to weaken democracy, and the like.
So Charles, you're a product of the best Western education. And in fact, if I recall, you spent 6 years on the faculty at Yale University, one of the great institutions in the world. Is it conceivable that these institutions, including Yale, would succumb to this? Would not be smart enough to pick it up and fight back? Is it that they missed it? Is it that they're somehow complicit? Is it that they're somehow minimizing the danger or simply focused on the money? What is it that explains why our great institutions, according to ISGAP's work, are capitulating?
It's a good question, and I don't think there's an easy answer, and it's a complex situation. But look, on the one hand, for more than 40 years, with Edward Said, going back to the sort of intellectual movement of demonizing not only Israel and Zionism, but Jewish people in the classroom, in the curriculum, with the pedagogy of our finest Ivy League universities.
For younger viewers, just explain who was Edward Said.
Edward Said was a very important professor of English literature and literary criticism. He claimed to be Palestinian, born in Cairo, a very important philosopher. He wrote about decolonization and post-colonial studies and Orientalism, and was a very important and integral intellectual in this sort of new postmodern, post-colonial studies. He
was at Columbia University.
Professor of Columbia University. I studied with him during my time at Oxford. He was a visiting professor there. And he famously said in 1983 that he's the last Jewish intellectual, the last remaining Jewish intellectual.
Understand, though he himself is not Jewish.
Right, he claimed to be Palestinian, Christian Palestinian. And he argued that American Jewish professors became fat scribes in the suburbs of America, and that the Palestinians were the Jews, and the Jews and the Israelis were the Nazis. When he said this in 1983, people thought he must have had a bad day, or he was disconnected from reality. But tragically, 40 years later, this is the discourse in our finest universities in the United States and in Canada, the UK, and other democracies. And for 2 generations, young people have been learning that Israel is a fascist, colonial, apartheid, occupying project, and that the Jews who support this, the Zionists, are Nazis. And from a liberal human rights perspective, if this is true, and of course it's a great lie, but if this were to be true, from a liberal human rights perspective, Israel would have to be dismantled. So on the one hand, with the use of funding and soft power to prop up this discourse, from a liberal perspective, Israel is under attack philosophically, ideologically, politically, and now even, maybe even militarily. And on the other hand, political Islam, which wants to destroy Western states or the vestiges of colonialism in the Middle East and the Islamic world, want to destroy the state and want to destroy Israel from an Islamist perspective, because from a Muslim Brotherhood perspective, a Jew or a non-Muslim cannot be equal to a Muslim in a caliphate according to Islamic law. So this attack is a 2-pronged attack on Israel and on democratic principles.
But let me come back to my earlier question again, if I may. But why would great institutions in America go along with this in any way, shape, or form? And so, you were at one of those great universities, Yale.
Right. So I was at McGill, I was at Yale, I was a student at Oxford, at the University of London. This ideology, this philosophical moment has permeated higher education across the United States and other democratic countries. So this stuff is happening in the classroom. And on the other hand, Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood and other entities, foundations and banks associated with this network of funding are giving, we estimate we know of tens of billions of dollars to American.
That's billions with a B.
Correct. That's what we've, traced and we can show. We suspect.
We ISGAP.
Correct. Is our amazing team of researchers. We estimate that the amount of money given is over 100 billion with a B, and this is just foreign funding. We know that Qatar and other entities are buying American banks and corporations and real estate companies, and these American entities are also giving money to higher education. So the amount of money and wealth that's being poured into our higher education is not only influencing, it's interfering with our curriculum, with our education. So universities that are getting, in the case of Cornell University, we found 10 billion with a B. Texas A&M 1.3 billion with a B that Qatar gave to Texas A&M.
But Qatar claims, if they were sitting here in the studio, wait a second, Dr. Small, this is for medical schools, this is for humanitarian projects, this is to advance research. You're just some pro-Israel group that's trying to undermine our reputation unfairly. How do you respond?
Right, so they will argue that, and they're trying to further science and incorporate young students from the Gulf into higher education, and it's, the American universities, the development offices at Cornell, at Columbia, at NYU, at Harvard, and Yale will say, we're helping to educate and democratize the Gulf. So this is all good. But here's a regime that calls not only for the destruction of the state of Israel, they call for the murder of Jews around the world. They believe in a worldview that believes in subjugating women, of murdering gay people, of destroying democracy. So they're funding, higher education, and they're using soft power, they're using influence to shift the discourse, to shift the nature of our education. And we know the most sensitive and important institution in any democracy is our universities. This is where young Americans learn to be citizens. And they're coming out of the classroom, they're going into the encampment, as we've been witnessing since October the 7th, and they're now pouring into the subway, pouring into our streets. These young people are our future journalists, future political leaders, and captains of industry. So if you influence higher education, you will change the society. And I think we're beginning to witness all of the soft power, the billions, tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars being taken happily by these institutions, these Ivy League universities, is shifting the discourse on not only Israel and the Jews, but on basic democratic principles. How is it possible that the graduates of Middle East Studies departments at Ivy League universities are in great numbers, professors and students, protesting on behalf of Hamas, protesting on behalf of a designated terror organization, an organization that calls not only for the destruction of Israel, but the extermination of Jews, in the same vein as the Nazis and the protocols of the Elders of Zion? How is it that our finest professors and students in large number are supporting this barbaric social movement that is diametrically opposed to a liberal education, a liberal democracy? How is this possible?
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly why I joined ISGAP a year ago, because ISGAP is trying both to ask those questions and to answer those questions. And the very future of Israel, the Jewish people, Western civilization in the United States may depend on finding the right answers and making sure that the decision makers are making the right decisions. And with that, Charles, thanks as always. And our first guest is Dr. Rachel Fish, whom I'm sure many JBS viewers know. I would simply summarize her extensive CV by saying she is a champion of the Jewish people, and she is a leader in both Israel education and Israel advocacy. And the rest, as they say, is commentary. Rachel, welcome to the ISGAP Hour.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Rachel, you spent many years trying to educate universities, educate secondary schools and middle schools about Israel, about its truths. What's changed in your agenda and your approach since October the 7th, if anything at all?
It's a very good question in terms of thinking about what needs to shift when teaching about Israel in a post-October 7th world. I would say that at least because of the way I was educated in terms of how to teach about Israel, part of that has remained core and fundamental, which is you engage with all of the complexity of Israeli society, of Palestinian history and society, where those narratives intersect, where they diverge, and you don't shy away from the complexity of the conversation. So that's a piece that is core to the way in which I approach teaching about Israel. I will also say, though, that there was a thinking for many that Israel was in a new reality, both the state, the people, and Jewry writ large, which was that the trope of never again would never again occur. And what we saw on October 7th is that Israelis and Jews around the world remain a vulnerable minority, and Israel as a state is part of the answer to addressing that vulnerability. And yet, even within the state, it is very real in terms of the pressures that Israelis face by those who seek the demise of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. And that has to be understood not in a theoretical framework. It has to be understood not as an abstract concept, but it has to be understood in very concrete ways. And we saw that on October 7th, and it can't be denied.
So, Rachel, to brass tacks, before October 7th, much of the teaching, especially the, if you will, the sensitive teaching, also spoke about the possibilities of a two-state solution. After all, there were truths on both sides. Therefore, the solution probably was positioned somewhere in between. But now, it seems at least, that there's an entirely new narrative, which you yourself just referenced, that this may not be at all about solving the 1967 borders, but rather the 1947 borders, whether in fact Israel even has a right to exist in Palestinian eyes. If that's the case, doesn't that dramatically change what goes on in the teaching modules?
For sure, it has to address exactly what you're highlighting. I would say, though, once again, for me, that's not new. And the reason I say that is because I actually pay attention to what Palestinian people and Palestinian leadership and Hamas has been saying for quite a long time. And I don't need an interpreter. I can hear it in their own words. And much of the leadership has not been talking about a two-state framework of coexistence, but rather a singular state of all its citizens, which means ultimately the disentanglement, of not only Israel from the West Bank and from the territory, but specifically the dissolution of a singular Jewish state that is both democratic and particular. If you look, David, at the future vision documents, which were written in the early 2000s period by Arab leadership from within the state of Israel, there's not a discussion about two states. That was in the future vision documents, just in the state, let alone what's coming from Gaza, let alone what's coming from the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. So I say this because, once again, Westerners, American Jews in particular, really, really desire for there to be resolution between peoples when there is a conflict. And resolution usually looks like things being resolved neatly with a bow tied around them in the Western conception. And Americans are very uncomfortable, and American Jews all the more so, with a reality that is very messy, that doesn't allow for resolution, and that doesn't allow for the bow to be tied. And part of that then requires a real serious conversation to talk about what is this actual conflict then? Is it territorial? Is it about religion? Is it ideological? And really look at it at multiple levels to understand the ways in which Israeli Jews, Palestinians within the state, outside of the state, have interacted or not interacted in a serious and meaningful way, knowing full well that there are some who do desire a two-state solution with a Jewish state alongside a Palestinian state. And for those Palestinians who are working hard for that every single day, their efforts are undermined by the leadership and by Hamas, who choose to move in a very different direction.
Charles.
Hi, Rachel. So great that you're here with us today. Thank you. You've been in the trenches for more than 20 years, and our paths have crossed over the years as we, fought anti-Semitism. You were speaking about the reality in the Middle East, and I agree. I think any student in the Middle East or anybody willing to engage the worldview of Fatah to Hamas to Iran, you can get a very clear picture of what's going on because they speak straight. We've also, in the course of our struggle against anti-Semitism in the United States, I've been in meetings with you where we have sort of been dismissed as being alarmist or not really doing proper research, and that we were wrong when we were warning people about the crisis in education and higher education, how the discourse was shifting when it comes not just to Israel and Zionism, but to Jews, to American Jews, and to democratic principles. Do you think that finally, after October the 7th, that there really is a sea change? Do you think the American Jewish community and its leadership is really trying to, with an open mind, trying to engage the reality that you've been warning people about for decades?
I do think that there is at least some shift that we see taking place among some philanthropists and also some Jewish communal leaders, and also a larger understanding amongst American Jewry about what is occurring. I'm not sure that it's understood to its core by some of the establishment organizations, and that poses a real challenge, partly because those organizations want to be the champions on their own and as singular institutions to say that they are addressing these issues. And we know that ultimately that's territorialism and that those leaders haven't addressed these issues and nobody's going to solve for it alone. So there is some movement. I will say 20 years ago, when I was ringing the alarm bell at what was already happening at Harvard University, the major philanthropic donors to Harvard and also to Columbia didn't want to hear it. They basically said the Jewish students need thicker skin. They also said things like they had a deeper desire to have their reputation associated with these premier and elite institutions than Jewishness. So I do think there is some reflection, some cheshbon nefesh that's taking place, some introspection. And I also think we see some of the philanthropists saying they're not going to give the same kind of dollars to these institutions as they have in the past. That being said, I'm not confident that they understand the underlying intellectual factors that have cultivated the hostility toward Jewish students and toward Jewish politics writ large. And there's a real educational process that needs to take place in order for them to understand more deeply. I also really hope that there's an awakening that you cannot start any serious education for students on these subjects the day before they walk onto the campus quad. This has to begin at a much earlier age. There has to be family education, and it has to be done seriously and deeply and substantively. And until I see philanthropic dollars investing in some of those kinds of initiatives, it will raise a question of whether or not we're holistically addressing these issues or if we're just looking to play whack-a-mole and put a Band-Aid on one particular, issue and not address the remainder of them.
So does that mean, Rachel, that you're continuing to meet resistance in some parts of the Jewish community, even after October 7th, and even after your concerns, which I remember from 20 years ago, because that's when we were first in touch, and even after your concerns have been proved correct?
I think the resistance is that, one, American Jews, some, really believe that America is going to be exceptional, and therefore this anti-Semitism is a blip. And they don't understand that right now, Jews are truly in the crosshairs between ideologies from the hard right, from the hard left, and radical Islamism that they cannot just dismiss. And that's a serious conversation that not enough American Jews have been willing to have. And there's still, to a certain degree, a more openness and willingness to identify the Jew hatred from the ideological hard right, and a willingness to dismiss the ideological Jew hatred from the hard left and from within radical Islamism. And we have to do a better job educating a much larger swath of Americans and American Jews about these particular ideologies, even if it leads to some uncomfortable conversations. So that's a piece of this, because if you don't fully grasp it and understand it, then you aren't willing to be able to identify it as directly. The other piece is that for the philanthropic community, many individuals have shiny object syndrome. There's a deep desire to solve these problems without a recognition of how long these problems have been in play. And you can't solve these problems with a singular program or a singular approach. And it will require a deep investment of financial dollars and human capital to work at multiple levels of a system in order to address them. And that's whether it's K through 12, whether it's institutions of higher education, whether it has to do with issues within Jewish education, whether it has to do with interfaith relations, intra-communal relations, etc. And we as a Jewish community still do not have a holistic strategy to approach each of these sectors in a very comprehensive way, because territorialism takes precedence rather than actually solving for the problems that we face.
And I wonder, Rachel, to add to what you just said, which I think was terribly important, I also find some American Jews clinging to the belief that if only there was a different Israeli government, maybe a government that wasn't of the right, but of the center or the comforting center left, that, none of this would have happened. They're clinging to this belief, I think, in part because to conclude otherwise is to conclude that there is no obvious solution. This way, at least, they want to believe that if only fill in the blank, Shimon Peres could come back to earth and lead the Israeli government, October 7th never would have happened. And we'd be talking now about dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the final agreement for a two-state solution. What do you say to them?
So first of all, let's remember a few things. One, that when you see the UN Resolution 3379 in the mid-1970s, who is the Prime Minister of Israel? It is not the right.
It was the Labor Party.
It's still Labor, right? I think it was still Rabin. So that is a left of center political party, and already the world and the global opinion of Israel had shifted.
By the way, viewers, Resolution 3379 was the infamous Zionism is Racism resolution adopted actually on Kristallnacht, November the 10th, 1975. I'm sorry to interrupt, Rachel, but there may be people who don't know that reference.
And Kurt Waldheim, the former Nazi war criminal who was the Secretary General of the United Nations, had a party at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel celebrating the passing of the resolution that evening.
Exactly. So I say this just to highlight that you had a left of center political leader, political government in Israel, and the seas had already shifted in terms of perception of Israel. Israel was no longer the David, but had become the Goliath. Didn't matter who was actually at the helm of the Israeli political leadership. That's one example. When we see Israel engage in peace and come to a peaceful resolution with Egypt, which political party is in power?
We know the answer. We could. Menachem Begin.
Exactly. And there was willing to be land for peace, an exchange of territory for peace and peaceful relations between Egypt and Israel by 1979 with a right-of-center political party. I say this only to highlight a political position does not determine the outcome of the relationship between Israel and its surrounding Arab countries, right? Just because you're left of center doesn't mean you automatically will find peace. Just because you're right of center doesn't mean you will constantly engage in war. So that's one piece of this. I actually have to remind Israelis, David, about this all the time, because I even hear from Israelis who come to study in America The problem is that we have this right of center Israeli government, and they make bad choices that make Israel look bad, and therefore American Jews then don't want to associate with it. Well, that's not exactly the case. Yes, there may be problems with the current government. We know what those problems are. We understand very clearly some of the problematic individuals associated with that government. There is no doubt about that. Many Israelis have been declaring for over a year now problems with this government. And it doesn't mean that they don't care about the Zionist project and the need to ensure that Israel is a strong Jewish and democratic state. I say this because it is very, very challenging for American Jews, especially a younger generation of American Jews, A, to have a historical understanding. They have a very short historical memory. B, they have no historical recollection of Israel being an embryonic state and constantly besieged. They only see Israel as engaging in conflict, and they only see it in these very short clips that allow very, very misperceptions to be established around Israel being this Goliath and looking as if it is seeking to only engage in harm. The third element of that is they have no recollection of Oslo, and they have no recollection of the way in which Israel, irrespective of the political leadership's ideological position, has tried to engage in advancing this idea of a two-state coexistence relationship between a Jewish state and a future Palestinian state. That is not discussed in their understanding of the history of Israel. If that is not part of their understanding, then it means that we as educators, as communal leaders, have to do a much better job providing that historical landscape and also being very clear that what's happening is not based upon what Israel does or doesn't do. What is happening right now is a larger narrative war conflict. It is actually a war that is taking place that has nothing to do with the reality and the facts and the data, but rather has to do with an ideological position in order to weaken the strong and strengthen the weak. And in this equation, that means Jews, and by extension Israel, have to be weakened in order to strengthen those who are perceived to be the primordial victim, i.e. the Palestinians. And that is a very serious challenge. And I'll say one more piece to this. Part of the issue is that at the end of the day, as vulnerable, which is not the same as victimhood, as vulnerable as Jews in diaspora may be, as vulnerable as Israelis may be, as we saw on October 7th, that vulnerability still allows for resiliency and grit and perseverance, which is truly what Zionism and the Jewish state are all about, because Jews are not going to go away and the state of Israel de facto exists. And that is the rub. That is the rub for the true detractors who do not want to see this entity in the midst of the region, who they see as a direct affront, whether it's against ideology, whether it's against a particular nationalism in their mind, or whether it's against a larger religious doctrinaire. And that's the challenge.
Charles.
So, Rachel, on another bit of a twist, on a more positive side, potentially, you can make the argument, or I would make the argument, that Israel was attacked by Hamas and its Iranian backers and Hezbollah and the Qatari financiers at a moment when it appeared that Saudi Arabia and the region was going to sign a major peace agreement. That there were, I think, in the Saudi leadership, for all sorts of reasons, that we have common enemies. They're worried about the growth of the Muslim Brotherhood and the threat that has to their kingdom and the threat of Iran. So I think Iran seemed to orchestrate the attack at a moment when the region would have shifted in a very significant way, where Israel would have been integrated into the region among allies. Could you comment on that? And does that give us hope that that can sort of take the wind out of the sails of the haters in the region, but also across the world and even in the United States?
Well, I think you're right, Charles, that we saw through the Abrahamic Accords even, right before even Saudi Arabia was willing to engage in a conversation around normalization of relations with Israel, that there were certain countries in the Arab world who held no diplomatic relations with Israel and who were then willing to do so. And that normalization of relations occurred irrespective of whether or not the Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership or Hamas wanted it to occur. And that was a threat to those individuals and to those countries and to those leaders. And it felt as if, in the context of the conversation here in America, that, for example, on campus around boycott, divestment, and sanctions, there was no understanding that the larger region was accepting this normalization, and you had more extreme positions on a campus in the Northeast than you did in the Middle East. That seems a little crazy when you say it out loud. And that's part of the challenge here, is that individuals who are interested in this in this conflict, who are interested in this history, have to understand that in Israel's Declaration of Independence in 1947, when it's beginning to emerge, is imagining and aspiring to normalized relations. That's what it desires. It may not achieve it. It may be imperfect in how it may occur or may not occur, but that's the end goal. And it's written in that declaration, in that aspirational document. And part of the issue now is that what do you do if the reality on the ground is such that there are certain entities, that there are certain political leaders, and that there are certain groups who will do all that they can to obstruct that reality of normalization? So this is a real question. I do think that what we are seeing is that there are countries who seek that normalization. I think Saudi Arabia will 100% come back to the table around normalization for all the reasons you outlined. It is good for Saudi Arabia. It is good in terms of relations. It is good for geopolitics. And it is a way to continue to have allies in a region in which Iran is a serious threat.
Rachel, I'm going to be unfair to you because we only have a minute or two left, and I'm going to ask you a big question, which I hope has some bullet point answers for now at least, and maybe we can return. Is there hope for educators trying to reach college campuses, middle schools and high schools in today's sort of zeitgeist? Is there hope for sharing your perspective on Israel and bringing some new realities to students who in some cases may be very resistant and to faculties that may be equally resistant? Is there hope?
I do think there is hope. And that's because I truly believe that education matters. I also see through the work that we do at Boundless and at Brandeis University that when we engage in education, we do see shifts that impact how people think, how people feel, and how people behave. I do think that that educational process has to be looked at longitudinally and cannot be understood as a one-off presentation. That's not how education works. You all know this. And that requires, then again, that investment of both financial and human capital to make this a priority. I also strongly believe that issues of anti-Semitism do not get solved solely by the Jewish community. Jew hatred is not a Jewish communal issue. It is an American issue. It is a Western civilization issue. Just like race, fighting racism is not only for people of color, fighting homophobia is not only for folks in the LGBTQ plus community. So we have to do a much better job to help Americans understand what is at stake when Jew hatred rears its ugly head, and that the tapestry of American society is trying to be torn apart and sow divisiveness amongst identity communities. And that's a case that most Americans do not understand. And most Americans, as you all know, don't even encounter or engage with Jews, Judaism, or Israel on a regular basis. So there are real opportunities, and those are the opportunities that propel and motivate me because I see the work that needs to be done, and it's an incredible opportunity, although it may be challenging.
Rachel, thanks for that offer of hope. And thank you even more for the work that you've been doing for so many years, for the work of Boundless, and for your determination to spread the truth. So, Charles, may I?
Rachel, thanks for joining us, and continued success in your important work.
And we will now
Thank you.
invite our next two guests to come, and they're good friends of Charles. And Charles, look forward to your introduction of our two new guests.
Great. So thank you, David. And we're really honored to have two friends of ISGAP, two old colleagues of mine. And David Patterson is a professor of Holocaust Studies. He was the director of the Ackerman Center, a very important center on Holocaust studies at the University of Texas at Dallas. And we're also joined by Cary Nelson, who's an eminent scholar. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Illinois in Champaign. Both David and Cary are members of the ISGAP team and academic advisory committee, and they do a lot of work with us on the academic side and also to put programming together, including the Summer Institute at Oxford University, now in its 10th year, where we'll all convene on the 28th of July at the University of Oxford. So David and I are happy that you guys joined us to discuss the issues of the day. So David, I'd like to turn to you first, and I was wondering if you could comment on sort of what we're doing at Oxford, where we're training university professors. We're trying to train young university professors to deal with anti-Semitism at the academic curriculum pedagogical level. Could you explain why you think this is necessary in the environment that we're functioning in with the explosion of anti-Semitism in the classroom on our university campuses, which I think caught a lot of American people off guard since October the 7th? Could you speak to what's happening in the classroom and why this work is necessary?
Yes, thank you, Charles. And David, thank you. The Oxford Summer Institute is a matter that's more important, more crucial, and more urgent than ever. And the epicenter of this storm of hatred that has swept across the globe is indeed the college and university campus. And our professors who attend return to their campuses, I think, very well equipped, and they say without exception that they're in a much better position to not only respond to what's happening, but understand what's happening. They understand that Hamas doesn't come out of nowhere, that the climate on the campuses is decades, if not more, in the making. They're very well informed, and they have a basis of learning from which to answer questions. And students have honest questions. What's going on? What's happening? Why the Jews? What's taking place? I have my own experience in the classroom, and I attended ISGAP 10 years ago as a participant, and I've been more deeply engaged all the time. So we know that there's something wrong, but we don't always know how to explain what's wrong, why there's something wrong with it, and how to respond to it. And the Summer Institute is crucial for that, articulating what's taking place so we can better understand what's taking place, and we can offer some kind of options for where to go from here. And many students and administrators want to know this as well.
Thanks, David. So, Cary, you're an eminent scholar, and I know you were operating in spaces our paths crossed. I was a young student at the time, but you were dealing with people like Stuart Hall in cultural studies and post-colonial studies, and I know you're very much engaged in the struggle against anti-Semitism in academia today. But can you speak to the blind spot that exists in academic discourse and studies when it comes to anti-Semitism? I think there's been some wonderful developments in the study of racism and gender inequality in post-colonial studies. Why do you think that the study of contemporary anti-Semitism isn't really on the academic map?
Well, there's been a real resistance on the part of so many academics. It's a wide phenomenon to understanding the conspiratorial character, the organized conspiratorial character of contemporary anti-Semitism. I think a lot of the Academy recognizes the many phases that anti-Semitism has gone through. We know something of what happened in early Christianity. We may know St. Augustine's model for keeping some Jews alive to teach the world of the dangers of theological error. And we know things like the Spanish Inquisition and up through the Holocaust. Even at that point, we still think of anti-Semitism in the midst of Nazi Germany's assaults as a hatred of Jews. And we don't tend to think of it as a theory of the great danger that Jews supposedly present to the world. So Nazi Germany really reveled in conspiracy theories, and that tendency, of course, has become really worldwide in many ways, especially since the foundation of the Jewish state. But anti-Semitism went through this decisive change in 1948. Before then, you could think of it, anti-Semitism, as a theoretical debate. Should there be a Jewish state? Should there not be? Jews themselves participated in that debate. But as of 1948, there was a real Jewish state to object to. And when you objected to the existence of a country that had been approved by the United Nations, which is quite unique in history to have an actual state affirmed by the United Nations at its moment of founding, then anti-Semitism became something different. And all the conspiracy theories then acquired this new anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic component. But rather than give a long lecture, which I'm mostly inclined to do, but I should resist, I need to remember that I'm not a faculty member here. Let's leap ahead to the present situation, when I think anti-Zionism suffered a huge wound and a fundamental change on 10/7. Nothing is the same since then. I find that really nothing in my life is the same since then. I was planning at this point to be working on a book on anti-Semitic German poetry from 1880 to 1945, and that's on the shelf because I really can't write about anything except the impact of 10/7 on the academy, which has been so huge. And it means that we need to understand anti-Semitism differently when we're confronting a phenomenon that was wholly unanticipated and that so exceeds any imagination that we had applied to the present scene before. I think in many ways, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have completely fused. The question used to be, when do you cross the line from one to another? And now the question is there any difference any longer? Is there anything that makes anti-Zionism different from anti-Semitism? In a way, that was there since 1948, but we still played with the difference. Now it's been erased, and we confront a world that's really much more threatening. And I really think that it's not going away. Even when the war with Gaza ends, accelerated anti-Semitism is going to be with us. And the blindnesses in the academy have just layered one on top of another.
Cary, you make a very important point that it's difficult, if not impossible, to separate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. In the academic environment at our best universities in the United States of America, if you were to make that pronouncement and even back it up in a scholarly paper or book or presentation, do you think now, after October the 7th, that there's a willingness to entertain that idea, or would you be rejected and marginalized? Is there now an openness in academia to really deal with these issues?
I wish I could be more upbeat in answering that question. I think I would meet more resistance than acceptance. Yeah. Obviously, I think the people on the screen here, all of us, are willing to entertain that change, but we don't represent the majority of the academy, for better or worse, well, for worse. So I think many people who study anti-Semitism recognize that this has happened. Yeah. But as for the general run of faculty, I think, and certainly of students, they are still determined to insist on the difference. It's a blind determination, but it's there.
Yeah. And David, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree with Cary. I think there'd be more resistance than ever to this idea that anti-Zionism amounts to anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is a comfortable and fashionable, and I would even say a morally required guise to cover the anti-Semitism, which is still, at least among some anti-Zionists, not acceptable. We all know people who say anti-Semitic things would be shocked if you suggest to them what you're saying is anti-Semitic. It's much easier to hate a state than to hate a person. It's much easier to hate an institution, and the Jewish state has become to the world what the Jew has in the past been to society. Cary's comment on the conspiratorial nature of this is very important. Also, it's conspiratorial for a number of reasons. One of which is that the evil is invisible. Conspiracies are about something invisible, something hidden. The protocols of the elders of Zion. They have a secret meeting. They're secretly controlling the media, the governments, colonial empires, imperialist, projects. And what has shifted, what used to be the anti-Semitic premise that, not all Jews are evil, but all evil is Jewish, has now become the anti-Zionist premise. It's not that Israel, the Jewish state, is evil, but all evil comes out of the Jewish state. And notice how they get tagged with whatever the going evil of the day might be. Apartheid, genocide, racism, colonialism, human rights violation. Israel has been sanctioned almost 3 times more frequently by the UN, negatively sanctioned, almost 3 times more frequently than the other 192 countries combined. Okay? So anti-Zionism is tied to the demonization of the Jews and the Jewish state. They are as invisible and as ubiquitous as Satan. And therefore, students in Saskatchewan get attacked when the Israelis try to respond to being slaughtered and raped and murdered. It's in the Jewish essence. It's in the evil of the Jew. And the Jew can't be a victim any more than Satan can be a victim. I think this is why you see a resistance to acknowledging the horrific butchery that took place on October 7th. Many women's groups, won't even talk about the brutal raping of those women. Many women's groups don't go near it. Some actually resist the whole notion. In academia, the women's studies program.
Yeah.
I think one could add that really many faculty members have based their professional and personal identities on the belief that they can be an anti-Zionist without being an anti-Semite. So when you ask them to think seriously about that, you're not just challenging an idea, you're challenging really who they like to think they are.
Yes.
And that's a personal threat to them. And so they tend to they tend not just to resist, but to get angry. I mean, you encounter, really an emotional reaction because you're threatening their sense of identity when you make that connection.
Many JBS viewers, I'm sure, are asking the question because they've asked me on other shows, what's gone wrong? What happened? In my case, I have adult children who all went through university, undergraduate and graduate, about 25 years ago, and everything was fine, or so it seemed. There were only a few universities that seemed to have issues. The rest were calm and quiet and safe. What's happened in these last 20 or 25 years that's turned things upside down, beginning with our most elite and venerated institutions?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, this has been on the campus culture has been decades in the making. The last few decades have been in
the
higher
making
learning.
by whom, David? By whom?
Professors, intellectuals, who teach PhD students and go out and become professors. Areas such as one of the areas where postmodernism, so-called, which is the relativization of all value, all truth, all meaning, has been in humanities, literary studies, and spills over into the social sciences, and from there into society. There's that collapse of a distinction between good and evil, which itself is evil. There's a reluctance to name the evil. There's a fear of being called
unless
racist.
the evil is called Jew.
Yeah, no, that is yes. All evil is Jewish. And there's this shifting from an understanding of human sanctity as endowed by the Creator, created in the image and likeness, with inalienable rights, to the ground of rights has become more ethnic, more dependent on the accidents of nature, like race and gender, sexual preference. So there's this collapse of what makes a human life matter. There's which is rooted anciently in Jewish teaching. There's an animosity toward what? Divine commandment, divine authority, any transcendent authority. It doesn't have to be God. The idea of good and evil. I was once told by a Holocaust historian, when we teach the Holocaust, we mustn't use the word evil because of the religious baggage. But anti-Semitism itself, and in its anti-Zionist form, has all the trappings of a religion, in my view. They have their high priests, they have their original sins, they have the unforgivable sins, they have their pathway to redemption. And that's part of what makes it so difficult to respond. You can't talk somebody out of their religion to the extent that their thinking has this religious dimension to it.
Now, unlike David, I don't believe postmodernism is inherently the problem, but the distortion and misrepresentation of postmodernism is a problem. I mean, the major postmodernist theorists believed in a difference between good and evil as a reality, and they believed you could decide what arguments counted for and didn't count for. And if you look at today's demonstrations, obviously there's a fundamental conviction in the encampments that they know the difference between good and evil. They know what's good, they know what's evil. They can't think about it, they can't mount a coherent argument, but in their hearts they think they know what the difference is. So that kind of distinction hasn't disappeared from the scene. But there's no one explanation for what's happened over the last generation or two. There are multiple things that happened. Over the last decade, identity politics, taking over a lot of campus debates, has distorted people's ability to look at evidence, to debate rationally. They think in terms of what their own feelings are. They think in terms of what pain they have felt. And they're resistant to actually looking at history, looking at arguments. Makes it difficult to defend the history of Judaism if you don't even think of it in terms of a history. If you think it in terms of only a struggle between good and evil. So that's certainly been a factor.
And Cary, I think that's going to unfortunately be the last factor for today's conversation. hoping we can return, and hoping you don't hold it against Charles and me. But we're up against the clock, which is unforgiving. So, Charles, if I may.
Yeah, so Professor David Patterson and Professor Cary Nelson, thank you for taking the time to join us today on Fighting Anti-Semitism, the ISGAP Hour, and really thank you for all you're doing, in ISGAP with our programming and our efforts. It's really appreciated, and all the amazing work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
David.
Charles.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Cary. And thank you, JBS viewers, for
Thank you,
joining
Cary.
us. And see you on our next program at the ISGAP Hour. Bye-bye.